these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths. We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. One underlying theme that you often hear about in at least conservative politics and even liberal commentary, and certainly on this podcast occasionally, is the rise of wokeism and what the heck that even means. We talked about it for a long time on college campuses, and I think a lot of people perhaps wrongly believed that those woke students would enter the real world and enter this rude awakening, right? The real world would slap them across the face and set them straight. Didn't seem to happen. It looks like they're the ones who changed the real world. They changed HR departments and corporate culture to an extensive degree. And nobody better to talk about this than our guest today, Vivek Ramaswamy. So we're joined by Vivek. He's a former CEO, successful entrepreneur and scientist who defected from the world of woke corporate America. His book, Woke Inc., exposes many dimensions of how many corporations have abandoned and focused on innovation and serving their owners and shareholders, employees, and are instead championing woke causes. So he does a great job revealing the underlying motivations behind why corporate insiders go woke and the consequences for our economy and society. So Vivek, thanks for being on. It's great to see you.
Good to talk to you again, Dan. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Let's just start with the announcement from this week. It made some headlines.
Yeah, look, I've been spending the last couple of years traveling the country. I wrote the book that I did, but part of what I wanted to do was to set the solution into motion as well. And so what I announced this week was that we are building a new asset management firm to compete directly against BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street. And I don't want to jump to the end of the story here, Dan, but to give you the punchline, these three firms control over $20 trillion of capital belonging to everyday citizens. Yeah. And they're sort of the upstream invisible force behind corporate America, behind this ESG-linked stakeholder capitalism progressive movement in corporate America, where they're the shareholders and they're telling the CEOs that if you don't adopt these progressive values, these political values in the way you run your businesses, then we're going to fire you. We're going to dock your pay. We're going to take over your board. And I think that's every bit as big of a factor. I think it's an even bigger factor than the rise of the employees, who the CEOs usually point to and say that, oh, this is what our employees want. Well, the backstop for the behavior of a CEO is really the shareholder. And this is how deep this infection goes. It's infiltrated even the capital markets that are supposed to bring discipline to the corporate boardroom, and instead are bringing a different kind of religion instead, not a discipline based on financial performance, which is what everyday pensioners and retirees and savers expect would be done with their money, but instead are bringing this new orthodoxy that's a way of enforcing policies that, frankly, some of your colleagues across the aisle may not have been able to jam through Congress. They're really just delegating it to the private sector instead. And I think that's probably one of the most dangerous forms of let's just say corporate interference that pose a threat to modern democracy itself. That's part of what motivated me on this mission. And so, we had some big names that showed up in the press release for people who are backing this new firm, but it's really not about them. And it's not about me either. It's about restoring the voices of everyday citizens in the economy. After all, it's their money that's being invested into the economy, by representing a voice in corporate boardrooms that encourage these companies to focus exclusively on excellence, on excellent products and services for their customers over these divisive political ideologies. And I think that's going to be a big part of the solution, which I'm looking forward to.
When you say defector, you describe yourself as a defector. Defecting from what exactly? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, look, I wasn't born into elite America, Dan, but I have lived it for the last 15 plus years, right? I went to Harvard, went to Yale Law School. I was at Yale Law School at the same time I was working at a hedge fund in New York City, earned 8 figures while working while being a law student. That's, not a usual experience, I suppose. Ended up being a hedge fund partner, then left, founded a biotech company, venture backed. I've kind of seen it all, if you will, over the course of the last decade as a relates to the elite institutions of modern America. And I had the privilege of enjoying some success there. I will say that there's a game you're supposed to play. Okay. The game is that you pretend you care about something other than profit and power, precisely to gain more profit and power. And, if it's one thing, if it's just a game and it doesn't have any negative consequences, and even if it allows some people to get rich, okay, that's one thing. But I think the consequences of this game are worse than that. I think it is fueling this crisis of, in some cases, well-placed institutional mistrust that is dividing our politics. It is dividing our economy, I think, to a breaking point. And when you have a politicized private sector that's as badly political as it is today, it stops being a place that can bring us together, whether we're black or white or Democrat or Republican. It doesn't matter if you're coming together to innovate in the lab of a biotech company, or you're coming together to play sports or create arts together. Once we've lost that, I think it's the beginning of the end. And so I felt like, was I defecting from saying the kinds of things I was supposed to say in, flying on a private jet to a fancy ski town and then musing about the racially disparate impact of climate change and solving for a better future for humanity in Davos or wherever? Yeah, I probably was. And it's not a bad life. I mean, I had, I had a taste of what that looked like. But I'm not some saint figure or anything here, but I did feel like it was important to be able to speak openly and transparently about the kinds of things that, by the way, my fellow CEOs and elite investors would say behind closed doors, but no one would say out in the open. And so that's why I decided to hang the jersey on that step of my career. For the last couple of years have been focused without an agenda, if I may say, writing a book, writing a couple books, speaking across the country. People ask me, do you want to go into politics or where's this all going? Is there some sort of other agenda? There's really no other agenda. There's no plan. I really wanted to, one of the things I found, I'm sure maybe you found the same thing in your career, I don't know, is once you make a plan for yourself, you inevitably become a prisoner of your own plan. And I didn't want to be a prisoner of the elite environment that I had inhabited over 15 years, but nor did I want to be a prisoner of my own plan. And I really enjoyed the latitude and freedom to speak freely over the course of the last couple of years. And then more recently, I think it occurred to me that, look, if I actually want to solve these problems, it goes beyond just writing books. And that's why I set out on this new venture to take down what I view as some of the most, let's just say, problematic root causes of these cultural cancers, starting in the asset management industry. And that's what I'm doing next.
Yeah, and I think that's important because people ask me questions. How are you going to solve our education crisis? And when people ask that question, they're referring to the sort of woke ideology infiltrating our curricula, whether it's at elite institutions or just elementary school, public schools. And they'll ask, what are you social media? Same question. The media generally, same question. It is not obvious that government is the answer to these things. We could make it the answer and betray the very principles we're trying to defend. And so it's conservatives end up in this slightly difficult position because of that. And I've long said you need our billionaire class to actually fight. They're the ones who have to do it, right? Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. Why didn't a bunch of conservative billionaires get together and buy the Washington Post? Why don't we buy a bunch of news outlets throughout the country? So Elon Musk obviously buying Twitter, although I read today that maybe that's off the table now. But that is the right avenue, and what you're doing is another great example of that. You need a counter. It doesn't have to be called conservative. It can be classical liberal. It could just be free market. It could just be free market, right? It could just be not crazy. Like, how about that? Because I don't know how BlackRock ends up in these places, and that's actually what I want to ask you about, because I was listening to a bunch of the things you were saying, and I have a couple questions. And I'll just say both of them before I forget both of them, because you said like it's a nice life, right? Going to Aspen, talking to these people about this stuff, and I'm like, my first thought was, why can't you live that life and not be woke? Because there's plenty of business people that do, right?
It's a great question. It's a great question, Dan. So you could, but there's something about just be open about your pursuit for profit and expansion of your business. Just be open about it and be proud of it. But I think there's something about the cloistered culture that we've created. There's something about going to Davos or Aspen or whatever that kind of that makes me cringe a little bit anyway. there is something untoward to me about musing in the isolated corridors that are purposefully created to separate yourself from the citizenry whose good you're musing about. I don't know. I mean, I lived in Manhattan for a while. I moved back to Central Ohio, 2 hours from where I grew up. You go a 50-mile radius of here, you get a pretty good cross-section of the country, left, right, black, white, doesn't matter. You got a pretty good cross-section of the people you're trying to serve.
Oh.
I think there's something to be said for that. But in principle, though, there's something about what you said that's right. Why can't you enjoy the fruits of your success? It doesn't have to be cloistering yourselves in Aspen and not sullying yourself with the hoi polloi. I don't like that attitude. But you know what? You can enjoy your life and the fruits of your labor and the fruits of your accomplishment and be unapologetic about it. That I'm on board with. I think that a lot of this originated with the 2008 financial crisis, Dan, where that's a whole separate discussion we can have. But look, there was a lot of crony capitalism heading into the 2008 financial crisis, crony capitalism coming out of it, and the bailouts that I was, by the way, against at the time. I had my first job in New York City in the fall of 2007 at a hedge fund. I saw this for the front row seat. But when the dust had settled after the bailouts, after what I think were the ignominious picking of favorites by Hank Paulson, who sat in the seat of U.S. Treasury Secretary with no justification picking certain firms to bail out, but not others, we can put that chapter behind us. In the wake of that, there was this new apologist culture born in the United States. Okay, it was fueled in part by the rise of a new wing of the left. Barack Obama was elected president of the United States. It was the beginning of this new identity politic obsessed wing of the progressive left that said, actually, beyond solving poverty and economic justice, we actually need to focus on racial injustice and misogyny and bigotry as independent axes from solving the problems of the old classical left, which were poverty or economic redistribution. Now there was this new valence to the problem. But business leaders then stepped into that void and said, okay, this could be all right for us. Okay, we'll talk about systemic racism all you want, as long as you don't bring up systemic financial risk again, because that's, Occupy Wall Street doesn't end too well for Wall Street. And so there was this uncomfortable arranged marriage between these bedfellows that didn't really love each other. I mean, this is not an arranged marriage of love between the neo-progressive left and big business, the post-2008 Wall Street establishment. But they got together anyway because each side got something out of the trade. And the part of the trade, the part of the sacrifice that the billionaire class in America made was that you can achieve success, but you have to apologize for it at every step. You have to apologize for it and make the appearance of sacrifices that may involve even some modicum of real sacrifices, but it's like the Price is Right rules. You make only as big of a sacrifice as you need to so as to avoid having the whole thing taken away. And that was their bargain with the new left, is with that, Price is Right rule, if you will. Go as high as you can, but without going over. Muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change, token minorities on your boards, talk about the unjust impact on racial minority groups or LGBTQIA plus movements or whatever it is. We'll say what you want. We'll even, donate some to the relevant causes, use corporate resources to underwrite it. In many cases, it's just CEO using somebody else's money anyway. Why not? And he'll say it's his shareholders' money, and his shareholders want him to do it because BlackRock and Vanguard are his top shareholders. He says, hey, they're my shareholders. They're telling me to do it anyway. BlackRock and Vanguard are fine doing it because it's not actually Larry Fink's money. It's the money of everyday citizens. So everyone else is spending somebody else's money on making a down payment to protect themselves from the ire of what used to be an old left that was skeptical of corporate power that now got in bed with it as long as that corporate power was advancing the ends that they saw attractive. And so, out of that was born this, I think, a legitimate child of the merger of corporate power and state power that was in some ways far more powerful than either one alone. And I think that is the defining challenge of today, both for the left and the right, right? If you're the left, you used to be skeptical of corporate power. You used to be skeptical of the concentration of economic power. But this new hybrid has duped the old left into submission by saying that, hey, we're going to advance the same values you want anyway, look the other way.
And justify the means.
Exactly. But for the right's part, if I may, I think the right is also lulled into submission through its old mantras saying the free market can do no wrong, without recognizing that that free market doesn't actually exist when you don't have the invisible hand of the market, but instead the invisible fist of government guiding the behaviors of those corporations. And I think I don't mean to be a broken record here, but I think it's such an underappreciated problem. One of the forces upstream of the entire private sector is this asset management cartel that is inextricably intertwined with the federal government, where we suffer the illusion that we live in a system of free market capitalism. We think Coke competes against Pepsi. We think Apple competes against Microsoft. We think Disney competes against Paramount Global or Paramount Pictures. You go down the list. You think Exxon competes against Chevron. Yet when you look upstream, it's the same three firms that are like the top 3 to 5 shareholders of every one of those companies. And all of them are pushing one singular agenda, which is the same agenda pushed by the party in power in Washington, D.C. today, as the biggest of those firms has numerous of its alumni staffing the federal, the Treasury Department, to the White House Council of Economic Advisors, to the Vice President's office. That is a modern form of crony capitalism of a kind that we have never seen in the course of at least the last half a century, where government is able to use these private companies like BlackRock to effectuate what government could not get done through the front door. But the BlackRock and firms like them gain competitive advantages through favorable regulatory treatment in response. And that's not the free market working. And so that's how conservatives are duped into submission, is, recite a slogan you memorized back in 1980, that the free market can do no wrong. That free market doesn't exist today. So both sides are duped into submission. And that's why I've stopped talking about, Republicans and Democrats. I think that, I know it's an election year and all, but that's less interesting to me than what I see as the real defining struggle of our time, which is not even between left and right. It is between the everyday citizen and the managerial class. And I think that is a transpartisan, transnational. You'll see it in Canada and Western Europe, in the UK and France, in Australia. This is a transpartisan, transnational war for the heart and soul of both capitalism and democracy, for the heart and soul of every institution, be it a school, be it a company, be it a government. That, I think, is the new axis that we need to liberate ourselves and unshackle ourselves from the identities and the labels we've adopted over the last 40 years, to see that that's what's really at stake today, is the voice of the everyday citizen and the managerial class who's tasked with protecting that institution. And, if I may, I don't mean to be, going on and on about this, Dan, but I will tell you a short story. It's my favorite story about Christ. It is a parable. It is not from the Bible. It is from Fyodor Dostoevsky's book, The Brothers Karamazov. It is in the chapter entitled The Grand Inquisitor. And it's a powerful story. I first read it in high school. It's a powerful story where Dostoevsky talks of Christ coming back to Spain in the height of the Spanish Inquisition. He's walking the streets of Seville. Mm-hmm. He's spotted on the streets. And the head of the church in Spain, the Grand Inquisitor, spots him on the street. And what does he do? He has him arrested, and he locks him up in a prison cell. And the height of the chapter is the dialogue between the Grand Inquisitor and Christ, where the Grand Inquisitor basically tells Christ that, look, we, the church, don't need you here anymore. In fact, your presence here is impeding our purpose. And so he sentences him to death, sentences Christ to death the next morning. And when I look at the companies in this country and what's happening and who controls the corporate boardrooms, when I look at the people who are controlling capital, firms like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, when I look at the people who are in charge of our school systems, the superintendents who run our public schools, the people who run the presidents of the universities and the boards of directors of universities, one institution after another, that is the managerial class that is sacrificing the true purpose of that institution to death at the altar. Much of that story is Dostoevsky, I think famously observed centuries ago. The church sacrificed its true purpose at the altar when it saw Christ himself. That's what's at stake here. And we got to elevate our discourse beyond, Republican and Democratic partisan politics to recognize that's the essence of what's actually happening today, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot to unpack there. I don't know if I'll pull the thread on. I don't like to reduce things in this sort of like good, evil. Things are so complicated. And
I'm not saying good and evil either, by the way.
Well,
but yeah.
Well, but little guy versus the big guy, average person. Because the thing about politicians trying to solve this problem is they all think they're on the side of the little guy. The right-wing populists think they're the ones who are truly representing the little guy. The left-wing populists or progressives think they're the ones truly representing the little guy. So it just doesn't get us anywhere.
It's a little different in my world, so I'll grant you that from the politician's perspective. There's no world in which BlackRock and Vanguard are actually representing the little guy, even though they're almost entirely managing the money of the little guy. So that's what the
progressive left would claim that they are, because the progressive left would say, well, yeah, but the little guy is more affected by climate change, right? Than because minorities are more affected by climate change.
I think you have to squint really hard to see it that way, but that's
100%. I think it's crazy, but this is just what they say. And so, I always just go back to first principles. If I'm going to start labeling and dividing, just to express the nature of the problem, we probably agree on the nature of the problem. One question I had too, as you were going through that, is like, what these CEOs really believe. Larry Fink, to me, it does appear to be a true believer. So Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, does appear to be a true believer. As you're going through the history of how this happened, I think it's interesting in that I don't think any of these people were true believers on Wall Street at first, but they've since become true believers. Because I guess if you hear the same thing over and over again, if that same woke nonsense keeps coming across your desk, eventually you just start to believe it through repetition. Or maybe what's happened too, and correct me if I'm wrong. So they're not true believers, but they have these pressures that you mentioned to act as if they're true believers. And so they hire these college students that kind of fit the bill for what a true believer would do. But these college students are indeed true believers. So it's like a little bit of both. So the institution changes from within. And I guess if I'm going to form that into a question, it's, well, you can respond to that. And then
there's just a lot to say there. There's just a lot to say there, right? So I think you're right. The truth ends up being somewhere in between. It's kind of like what Jean-Paul Sartre said of the truest lie. The deepest lie is the one that you convince yourself of in the end. And so, I think that 70% of cases, this was mostly an inauthentic form of stakeholderism on the behalf of CEOs that realized that this was actually going to, at least for themselves personally, going to be the best personal path forward, all things considered. Managing their own reputation, time, personal seat of power, but then convince themselves that they actually believe this stuff. I think the part you talked about that I think was most interesting to sort of delve into a little bit more is whether the college students or the millennials that graduate and join the workforce, and millennials, and now we're talking Gen Z here, whether they really are true believers, as you put it. I know what you mean by it, and I think I agree with the spirit of the line you threaded there. I would just phrase it a little bit differently, actually. And this has been my own personal experience. I mean, companies I've run, campus recruiting at Harvard, MIT, Yale, et cetera. I've had a front row seat to this, and I have a little bit more of a small, I would just say, light of optimism here, if we're able to get this right. I wouldn't describe them as true believers. I would describe them as a generation that is hungry for a cause, hungry for purpose, hungry for meaning, and hungry for identity. And they are lacking the kinds of things that used to fill that void of identity and purpose and meaning. Maybe it was faith. Maybe it was patriotism. Maybe it was national identity. Maybe it was even the notion of hard work, the identity and pride that you derive from hard work. Maybe it was the idea of a stable nuclear family. Maybe it was some combination of all of those things. But as all of those things in different ways have receded in modern public life, there's still a vacuum. I mean, we're human beings. We're hardwired to want to believe in something greater than ourselves.
Everybody has a religion. Whether they believe in Christianity or not, it's everybody has a religion.
Exactly. And so they're going to go to a new religion instead. And the most dangerous kind of religion is the kind of religion that you're practicing without realizing that you're actually engaging in the practice of religion. And that's what's happened today is I think that, that's created a moral void. And so you could debate the causal relationship goes in some ways. Sometimes they're driving behavior at these companies. I think that that's less than people appreciate. I think a lot of even commentators on the right mistake what's happening, where actually the CEOs still are responsive to their ultimate shareholder class. The ultimate shareholder class, that's actually where the upstream problem lies, the top shareholders of Disney, for example.
So I have a question about that too, which is, so let's take your average CEO who's probably not a true believer, but is a corporate CEO in general.
I don't think Bob Chapek is a true believer, by the way. Let me just throw that out there. Yeah.
Who's
he's the CEO of Disney. Sorry. Yeah. He's the current CEO of Disney. Yeah.
No, he absolutely isn't. I mean, he said his like he resisted
not a true
this,
believer.
right? Yeah, he's not. And but you know what he is? He's reluctant to take any risk whatsoever. You know, he's a risk mitigator, which is a very corporate way of being. When people ask me like, what's the wrong with the woke military? First, it's not quite as bad as people. It's bad. There's issues that like I've developed a whole report on, but I tell people it's you have to understand the problem. Well, this is the question actually. They say once you become an admiral, a general, they just become really political. They become politicians. And I'm like, that's not quite accurate. What they become is corporate. That's what they become. And which means unwilling to take any risk whatsoever, because and risk looks like an angry mob on Twitter to these people. You know, risk looks like the wokes coming after you because they're passionate and they're loud and they seem numerous. And of course, risk seems like shareholders taking their money out. And that actually gets to my question, which is that fear really warranted? I mean, is there really no other capital besides ESG capital?
Well, you know, the answer is, I think that fear is somewhat warranted and that needs to be fixed in today's market. Look, the three largest asset managers. Look, I just want to make clear how real this trend is, especially if you're a public company. And I think it's different if you're a private company versus public company.
Okay.
Let's talk about public companies here.
It's an important distinction.
Yeah, public companies, which are, most of the big companies in America and around the world are public companies. The top shareholders of nearly every public company are these three firms. It operates like a cartel. And by the way, when you look at the percentage of votes that actually get cast when appointing a board of directors and when adopting a shareholder resolution, many individual small potato shareholders don't vote. So if they own 20 to 30% of every company, those three firms alone, that's effectively the decisive majority that in some cases that actually end up voting the shares. And Larry Fink, I mean, he's the CEO of BlackRock. He writes a letter to America's CEOs. I mean, think about the hubris of one individual, right? Mm-hmm. Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's business partner at Berkshire Hathaway, recently said, Larry Fink is not my emperor. But the reason he said Larry Fink is not my emperor is that Larry Fink behaves as though he is the emperor of corporate America, and the rest of corporate America behaves as though he is too, writing a letter to CEOs every year from his perch, telling them how they're supposed to behave.
I've seen some of these. I don't know if I can't remember if it was from
staggering.
BlackRock. But I have seen it. It was not from BlackRock. It was from. You're like the problem is deep. And I guess the simple answer to my question was yes. People are legitimately afraid.
Is the answer. They're legitimately afraid. I don't think they need to be legitimately afraid of their employees because the diversity of views amongst employees is far greater than the diversity of views represented by the most vocal segment of employees on Twitter. So I don't think that CEOs should be afraid of their employees. As a point of fact, though some particularly weak ones might be, I think most of them recognize that. But when they're sandwiched between the employees, and the employees are, of course, a diverse motley group, but the vocal employees on Twitter, but combine that with force from the top. And by the way, 20th century corporate law was built on the idea that the CEO reports to the shareholders. Well, when the shareholders are telling you to do it, that turns that logic on its head. And, you're kind of an academic guy. I think you'll understand this. 20th century corporate governance and law and whatever was all built on this idea of the separation of ownership and control. That's a problem to solve, where the CEOs control the firm, the shareholders own the firm. That's where this idea of fiduciary duties from the CEO to the shareholder came from. That was all 20th century stuff. Like, we all learn it, if you go to law school or business school or whatever, it's like, trite. Okay. The problem in the 21st century is not the separation of ownership and control. That's asked and answered. The problem is the separation of ownership from ownership. That is, the people who pretend to be the owners are not the actual owners. The actual owners of Disney and Apple and every company in between are the everyday firefighters, nurses, rich people, poor people, big guys, small business owners, big business owners, but the people of this country whose capital is wielded in ways that they're today not aware of, in ways that would make their blood boil if they knew what was going on. So to answer your question,
401ks, yeah,
exactly. So should a CEO? Is it actually as bad for a CEO who's in the position they are? For public company, I think it is pretty darn close to being exactly that bad. And I think too much focus on the spineless CEO and not enough focus on the cynical forces that he has to be responsible.
The incentives that he or she faces,
or mandates.
Yeah. Well, let's get to mandate. So let's talk about ESG. Let's define ESG investing. This is difficult for us to deal with. And I've seen this I've seen this rear its ugly head very badly in the energy sector. I see less capital going to where it needs to be going to in the midst of high gas prices for many factors, but ESG being one of them, and ESG being environmental, societal, governance, or social. I can never remember.
I mean, they change it by day. They change it by the week anyway. It's very hard. They make it very hard to be anti-ESG because you can't even define what ESG is. Makes it impossible to be anti-ESG.
And then companies make like a whole living off of building scorecards. Like they'll like give us, we will assess your company and give you an ESG score and tell you what you need to do. Tell you what you need to do to improve your ESG score. This is the letter I saw because somebody sent it to me. It works in defense, and he's like, I do really important work for the nation's defense. Like I build things that we need. This is important. I'm being told by this investor, well, the company that does my ESG score, that they're gonna slaughter me on ESG scores, which will hurt my capital inflows if I don't just kind of divest from defense because it promotes some kind of like whiteness or Western civilization or whatever
whatever it is, exactly.
Yeah. It's scary.
So look, let me just give you the crispest statement of what the stakes are for the ESG movement vis-a-vis the energy sector. Okay. And we could talk for hours on it, but let me just summarize as much of that as I can into a brief analogy. Okay. Suppose the CEOs of Exxon, Shell, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips got together in a room in Davos, and they decided to cut gas prices and gas prices at the pump, cut gas production, and gas prices spike at the pump as a result. That would be the stuff of movies. Yep. There would be handcuffs. People would be going to prison illegal on price fixing allegations, cut and dry, illegal, harmful to the consumer, coordination amongst competing firms, a violation of what the free market sees to favor, textbook antitrust case, okay? Now, fast forward. Suppose the same firms are actually the same owners of those competing firms. And suppose that those owners of these companies all force them to do exactly what I just described to you. We celebrate that as ESG today.
Yeah.
That is the ESG movement in a nutshell. That is basically what happens. I think it is possibly, these are my words, these are not my words, these are words of the Arizona Attorney General, possibly the largest antitrust violation in history. There was actually a column in the New York Times today, which the guy called me a few days ago. I think his name was Farhad Munji. He wrote a pretty fair piece. I think he opened it saying, look, when I got on the phone with Vivek Ramaswamy, I didn't expect to find common cause. But by the end, I found myself nodding quite a bit, where he wrote a piece saying that 3 firms shouldn't own the entirety of America, no matter what you think of the values that they're advancing. And I agree with them. Matt, I think that this is a form of coordination between competitors that leaves everyday consumers holding the bag. And it also makes our companies less successful than they otherwise would have been. Yeah. But again, I find it very difficult to be anti-ESG. It's like there's a really funny fallacy in philosophy called the no true Scotsman fallacy. And you'd say, no true Scotsman, let's just say no true Scotsman drinks porridge. And then he will say, well, my friend Andrew is Scottish and he drinks porridge. And they would say, well, no true Scotsman named Andrew would drink porridge or whatever, just to kick the can down the road. Not named Andrew would drink porridge. And it's kind of like what the ESG movement does. Weapons manufacturers are not ESG. Well, then the European Union got together a few weeks ago and said, well, weapons manufacturers are ESG so long as they are shipping weapons to the right people. And by the way, that's a whole separate point. I think what Russia's done is wrong. I think we need to geopolitically stand against Russia. But the hypocrisy of the ESG movement with a couple of corporate monarchs deciding on a given day what the right answers to these political questions are, that's a different matter and that I can't abide.
Inconsistent.
And it's inconsistent. And what do I think most people want? I think most people want something pretty simple from their private sector, which is to tell companies to focus exclusively on delivering them excellent products and services at competitive prices and put that ahead of any other social or political ideology. Yet for the last few years, we've seen a reversal of the priorities of companies. the good news is I think we're already seeing the beginnings of a counter shift in the other direction.
Seems like the backlash is happening
right now. We unveiled our company, a Monday of this week. By Wednesday, BlackRock had, and we generate a lot of press on Monday and Tuesday, and there's big name people behind it and whatever. But by Wednesday, BlackRock had made an announcement that actually this year they're not going to take as harsh of a stance on some of their climate change proposals that they'll be voting in favor of. Right? Netflix, and I believe the BlackRock one, if I had to bet, was directly responsive to the press we generated against them. But the following wasn't, which is what we saw from Netflix, actually, I think yesterday or the day before, saying that they send a memo to employees saying that, you may be asked to work on projects that will make you uncomfortable, whose content you disagree with. We're going to prioritize artistic creativity. And if not, you can show yourself the door. I just think that the tides are now changing, where we've seen the stock market crash in recent weeks. It's been driven by I think one of the factors has been the easy money policy of the Fed that's allowed a lot of this sort of corporate excess to go unchecked. And with tightening monetary policy, with a declining stock market, it's not going to be pleasant in the short run.
You got to cut the fat. Yeah.
But exactly. It could be
ESG
good for
is fat. It's just, it's pure fat. It's pure feel good fat, because fat always feels good. Well, no, it feels good to eat fat. Never mind. You know what I mean? Yeah. And, you call this like corporate cronyism 2.0. And I think that's a pretty accurate description. I'm curious what you think government's role in this is, because corporate cronyism, as I usually define it, is big businesses, they actually like regulations. That's the dirty little secret.
Of course.
And this is a problem I sometimes have with like the bigger oil companies, because they look, on the one hand, they're trying to survive with the ESG environment. Like it's not like they like this crap, to be fair to them. That being said, they also know they can survive it. And they're very well aware that mid to smaller size companies cannot survive it, but they can buy that up. So, I'm always like, hey, I know you're saying you're for a carbon tax, but like I am not, because I have to look at the whole picture. And so I know it looks good on your ESG score, and I know you guys are doing it to virtue signal, but I wish you wouldn't, because it makes my job harder. And I am truly trying to argue for the truth here about what is best, both for climate change and reducing emissions, but also saving our economy and making sure we have energy security. So don't make my job harder, please. This is the kind of conversation I have. But, again, going back to the broader strokes here, corporate cronyism, my definition, advocating for regulatory capture mostly, that favors big companies because they have teams of lawyers and teams of compliance teams that a small business cannot possibly adhere to. I say Republicans need to be for what I call small business economics, which is a very simple concept. What are the regulations that make it easiest for a startup to survive? If we are driven by that very simple goal, we will end up with true free market principles, I think. But you talk about corporate cronyism, capitalism 2.0, which I think is interesting, which is this sort of, I'm going to quote you. Here's how it works. Big business uses progressive friendly values to deflect attention from its own monolithic pursuit of profit and power.
Yeah, and there's a further element to it, which I get to later on in there, which is I think part of it is they're tithing in a new currency. That's the part I'm talking about there, where, rather than making corporate donations through the front door to a political campaign, you tithe in the currency of identity politics and neo-progressivism. Mm-hmm. But there's a even more nefarious dimension to this, Dan, and it's that it's not just they get favorable regulatory treatment versus their competitors, including insurgents against existing incumbents. That much is well known, and you're right to point it out. I point it out as well. But it's that the demand in return from government is that they're able to delegate to those companies the dirty work that government could not constitutionally carry out on its own. Yep. The sector that's actually mastered this is Silicon Valley, right? So what Silicon Valley realized was the old threat to the monopoly power of Silicon Valley used to come from generally the left-wing end of the political spectrum. Mm-hmm. What they realized is actually if we can use our consolidated market power in service of that one-time enemy instead, then we can actually have it both ways and kind of keep that power structure intact. And there is no doubt in my mind. I mean, I've been writing about this since January 2021. It was considered a provocative idea then. Today, it's almost obvious. It's plain as day that in many cases, the party in power in the United States has used technology companies in this country to censor content, including hate speech, misinformation, whatever you want to call it, that the government could not censor directly through the front door.
Well, this is a point I make all the time. And Republicans need to make it better. I've been on social media longer than anybody in Congress. Since 2004, just because that's when I was in college, and I was on Facebook, so I understand it pretty well. And I've been watching guys like Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg for a very long time as well. Not quite who the right thinks they are. They're liberals for sure, and they're biased for sure, but not quite the same way that their employees are.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very different.
Jack Dorsey's misunderstood by the right, actually. I think that in his heart of hearts, he really did idealize and sort of have this idyllic vision of Twitter as a forum for free speech.
Like a true like libertarian kind of place.
And this goes to the point I was wanting to make earlier, where it's not like when I talk about the managerial class and the everyday citizen, it's not a little guy, big guy thing. Okay. Elon Musk is not a member of the managerial class. Jack Dorsey is not a member of the managerial class. That's a separate human ethos, the creator. And many of us are part of the creator class, which is neither the everyday citizen nor the managerial class. And the most successful creators are wealthier than both. It's a different axis. The managerial class is that risk-averse class that you talked about, that lacks vision, that bureaucratizes and tries to technocratize fundamentally normative questions. And it was the managerial class of Twitter that ultimately sucked the life out of Jack Dorsey. I think he probably, I'm not his therapist, but I think he probably decided he had enough of it, went to French Polynesia, where he was running the company from, ran away from it. And it's why he said he's the happiest person to see it, Twitter end up in the hands of Elon Musk, if that's what it does. But you're right.
It's a fascinating statement.
They're misunderstood, right? Mark, Jack Dorsey types in particular. But over time, that managerial class often includes people who float horizontally between being the member of who sits on a given board of directors versus getting an ambassadorship to Switzerland or wherever it is versus the associate dean at some university. It's kind of the same. It's the same sort of vision lacking, sort of soul crushing spirit of the manager that ultimately takes over the bureaucracy of both corporate America and kind of keeping what I call deep corporate that lends itself to such facile government capture. That's what we've seen.
And the point I was going to make was Republicans need to understand is not to fall for certain tricks. And sometimes we did. And I think we fell for some tricks with the Facebook whistleblower. So this whistleblower comes out and says, look, Facebook knows that, the social media isn't good for kids. I'm sorry, I don't need a study to tell me that. It's very clearly not good for kids. It's not good for adults either. It's making a lot of people freaking crazy. All right, it's a new way of communicating. New ways of communicating are difficult for the human brain to deal with. It's going to take us some time. Fact. All right. Now, Republicans fell for the trick because the obvious option is regulation of that particular asset. And so once we open that door, the Democrats are getting exactly what they want. And like, this is what I was trying to tell people. I was like, just take a step back here, guys. Take a step back here. I know we care about the kids, but like, this is exactly what they want. Whether you believe it or not, Dorsey and Zuckerberg have seriously resisted this. I know you don't believe that, but they've seriously resisted this takeover. And you need to be aware of that and not fall for the trap that they've set for you, that they being, the whistleblower, the Democrats, the whistleblower who happen to have just the left-wing publicists and campaign like ready to go. Just imagine how organized that was. It was all planned. And it is the Democrats' way of taking on free speech because they know they can't do it from the legislative branch.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you're spot on with respect to the feigned retreat, the feint, performed by this direction towards protecting harm of teen girls on Instagram or the anger of Facebook users. Look, I actually, I had been a big critic of censorship practices of big tech, in part, especially because it was at behest of government. And, I'd written extensively about that. And so, a bunch of people wanted me to come back and castigate, cable news and whatever other interviews come to me to make sure I'm, with the expectation that I'm also going to lambast. And now look what these other big evil villains in the technology universe are doing by making products that are knowingly making teen girls' lives worse or whatever. My view was slightly different than that. Okay. It was considerably different than that, actually. we should not want Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or the people who run Facebook or Twitter to be responsible for being the priests of our society. I mean, the reason teen girls suffer body image issues when they use Instagram start in the offline world. We lack the forms of psychic security, family, faith, foundations for giving people, human beings, the lack of insecurities that these algorithms are ultimately, built to prey on human insecurities. Social media could not exist without the ability to prey on human insecurities with algorithms. Click on something for envy, for lust, whatever it is. And at the end of the day, the right answer to that question has to start with institutions and practices in the offline world, right? Churches, communities, schools, family, we could talk about what that is. And we're making the problem worse by saying that actually Zuckerberg and Dorsey need to be the ones taking more responsibility for managing psychic insecurities that originate in the offline world, that we're abdicating our responsibility for actually doing that hard work instead by pinning that on them instead with this shorthanded view that, just because a platform does something bad automatically makes the thing that's bad, the bad effect of what they're doing, their responsibility to fix, as opposed to fixing the aspects of our culture that lent itself to be exploited in the first place. And those are hard conversations that I think a lot of conservatives missed and, as you said, fell into the trap of. So I'm in total agreement with you.
I pointed out at the time, I'm like, I grew up without the internet, and I remember a lot of movies about teenage angst, because it turns out that teenage angst has been around for a very long time. It is,
and the way you address it is not through social media changing its algorithms. It's through the human experience that everyone goes through as an adolescent, and with the foundations, family or otherwise, that help you get through it.
Which is harder. That's obviously a much harder thing to change, or a solution to find. And people look for the easy buttons.
But that's what we need to be talking more about, actually, is the revival of the kinds of things that used to fill that vacuum of purpose and identity, and that gives us some sort of guiding principle around which to organize our lives. You can call it faith, you can call it religion, you can call it, for different people, it'll be different things, civic identity, national identity. That's what we're missing. And I think until we fill that void, we can criticize the other side, whoever the other side is for that matter, on a given day, till we're blue in the face for the poison that fills the void instead. Yeah. But I think the right answer is to fill that void with something far more rich and meaningful in our civic culture that we have failed to do. And by the way, once we do that, Dan, then we can get back to free market, a true system of robust free market capitalism, where we don't have the kinds of moral insecurities. If some guy ends up with more green pieces of paper than the other guy, they're still just green pieces of paper at the end of the day. A yacht's a yacht, but no big deal if we're all co-equal as citizens in the ways that mostly matter, matter most.
And in many ways, the American experiment is that, right? This way for people from different walks of life, different origins, different ethnicities to actually come together and share something. We share the mythology of American creation. We share our love of our founding fathers, our love of our founding documents. We celebrate the same holidays together. These things bring somebody together. The woke progressives, they're step one. If you're going to create a revolution, is to undermine those foundations and to tear that society apart. And social media has, of course, enabled them in many ways to do that, because it just enables mass communication in pretty severe ways. And everything we're talking about with woke corporations is another byproduct of that. But I do think there's kind of method to this madness. May have started with Soviet information operations over the course of the Cold War. People don't realize 90% of their entire budget was for information operations, not necessarily espionage, not the sexy stuff. Like, it's not like running sources and spies and gathering intel. That's like 10% of what they did. It was a lot of what we did, not very much of what they did. They were much more concerned with changing narratives, and still are, by the way. Recently, a lot of people are falling for it, frankly. It blows my mind. It's a separate conversation. But, you got to look at the why behind the woke. And I think dismantling foundations is a pretty major one. And it's a scary thing, but I think people are waking up to it in pretty serious ways also, and thinking like, look, this culture war can be defined in many ways, but I think the main battlefront is the simple question of, is America a good place or is it a bad place? And if it's a good place, then we share it together and we like it. And to your point, which I think you've made a couple of times, maybe not explicitly, but you got to stop politicizing every freaking thing that we used to just share. Like we all used to just be like, okay, screw you on politics. But let's go to the game, right?
Yeah,
let's go to
exactly.
let's go to a game and like yell at each other about our sports teams, or let's go to the movies. But now the actors have to express their wokeness. And so you're like, oh, no, I can't watch that damn movie
for that matter,
or the players.
Exactly.
And you're like, why? And so, that's a difficult thing to fix because it's up to individuals with this power. But again, so we all have to speak out against it and change those incentive structures. One thing I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned, we've got to find that purpose that isn't these fake religions. How do you have any ideas on how to do that? Because I'm all ears. Some people talk about, for instance, civil service. Everybody has to do a year of some kind of civic service, whether that's joining the military or Teach for America or something like that. I'm always kind of reluctant to impose things like that. I'm not a huge fan, but I understand the logic behind it as far as bringing us together towards something. I mean.
So I have something that look. So everything we've talked about so far, I'm in the category of rock solid belief on. Everything we're about to talk about here, I don't have the answers, but I am open to, as I think we all should be, because we have to be, to get there, open to ideas that we can iterate on and say that, what, this may get us on the right track, but this may not be the exact solution. So what I'm about to say fits in that category. I like civic service. I don't like the imposition on the free will of free agents as adults in a way that requires civic service. And so here's where I land. Weave it into primary education. And we have this thing called summer break, which is broadly a vestige of like teachers' unions and lobbying. And for those who want to talk about systemic inequity in the education system, it's actually kind of interesting to observe that kids from wealthier families do way better after summer break. There's like a well-known phenomenon amongst kids of regress. It's post-summer break regress. Regress is a lot smaller.
Yeah. That's why I like year-round school for that reason.
What's that?
That's why I like year-round school.
Exactly.
Around that reason.
So I'm saying that let's take aim at that and sort of create some notion of shared civic service that we weave into primary education. And it's different with kids than with adults, because we already accept that kids are not fully formed agents and fully formed citizens. Even the most strident libertarian isn't amongst us isn't going to believe that those same principles apply to kids who aren't fully formed adults or fully formed agents. I think that that's something that I think is the kind of solution that we ought to be talking about. The kinds of things that might have made you and I cringe 10 years ago with our, autonomy-loving, quasi-libertarian, orientation. But I think today we live in a moment where we have to still respect the autonomy and freedom of individuals, but to recognize that the civic space of our lives is different from the economic space of our lives. Both are really important. And the civic space and fulfilling the vacuum of that's left in the wake of that civic space might be a precondition for our economy functioning perfectly. Because if not, that's how we get a polluted economy as well, a politically polluted economy. And so, that's an example of the kind of idea that I would be much more receptive to today than I would have been a decade ago. I can't promise you that that's the single end-all be-all answer. I also think that there's room for some galvanizing legislation. Okay, and the function of this would be more important than the actual product. It would be the solidarity we build around doing something like this, which is to say that, what, we are going to, so long as we accept that we have protected classes in this country, race, sex, religion, national origin, sexual orientation now counted in that mix, we're going to say that political belief and political expression is a protected class too. It's an expression of American national identity. To say that America is the country where you do not have to choose between putting food on the dinner table and expressing yourself freely, between the American dream and the First Amendment. You get to enjoy both of those things at once. Now we can debate the merits of that law. How does it get passed? But put that to one side. It's the kind of the statements of national identity, the revival of those few values that bind us together, whether we are black or white or Democrat or Republican, man or woman, it doesn't matter. The few ideals that bind us as citizens together in a country where, unlike most others, we're not founded on the basis of a single ethnicity or religion or language or food or monarch. we're a polyglot, divided group of people that came together 250 years ago around a set of ideals. And I think part of what we have lost is the content of those ideals in the first place. And whatever we can do to revive those ideals, maybe it's civic service into primary education during summer break. Maybe it's broadly galvanizing policies that ought to transcend partisanship, like making political expression of political belief a protected class, just like race and gender. I don't have the answer for what the one answer is. I doubt there is one silver bullet answer, but these are the kinds of things that I think the conservative movement needs to do a better job of talking about, or at least ideating about, to fill that vacuum of national identity and national purpose, rather than just critiquing every bit of poison that fills the void. Because once you get one piece of poison out, it's just going to be a new postmodern poison that fills the void instead, until we've filled it with something far more meaningful. So I want to say thanks for having me on today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, appreciate you being on. Really fascinating conversation. And I think it gives a lot of people a lot to think about. You got a new book coming out on victimhood, which I've written about a lot. I mean, when people ask me what's the biggest threat to America, I say, well, there's a lot. But one, and a primary one, is the refusal to take responsibility, and the elevation of victimhood as instead of being a vice or a source of shame, but a source of pride, right? Elevating it to this sort of heroic status. We worship the victim, and you seek to be the victim. I mean, how else do you explain Jussie Smollett, as they say? Juicy Smollett. Yeah.
But I have a funny name. I don't begrudge him for his name. I begrudge him for feigning a victimhood incident. So listen. But
the fact that there's an incentive in the first place.
There's an incentive structure. People respond to incentives. It's funny. It sounds like you could have written my book. Because it's actually a lot of that's into. We used to be a nation of underdogs. We're now a nation of victims. And you know what? This runs in a lot of different directions, Dan. And I want to call this out because I think that. Look, if you really care about lifting up Black lives in this country, I think you'll be more successful to do it by not talking about systemic racism and talking more about Black victimhood. And I think that people say, if you're not Black, you can't talk about that. I'm not Black. I will talk about that because I actually care about delivering the end solution. There's not going to be a solution to Black poverty, Black education rates, Black incarceration rates in this country until we have an open conversation about Black victimhood culture. But I will also tell you this. We are seeing a new epidemic of white victimhood culture that I think we have to call out in response to. And I think it's part of the conservative victimhood narrative. And I worry that part of what we see is the rise of this victimhood Olympics, where everyone is using that victimhood. It's like a cryptocurrency that's trading in a bubble and it's crashing. It's like victimhood is this bubble and everyone's just cashing in while it's trading in at an all-time high. But at the end, there is no winner to the American victimhood Olympics. There's only one loser in the end, and that's America.
This is why I've been fighting with my own side, so much recently.
Just keep doing more of it. Is conservative victimhood culture.
Is because that victimhood culture. Because I've been talking about the left forever, and I think I can win that debate. I can't win it if we're acting the same.
Exactly. Blame some sort of legal immigrant who came to this through the front door. Well, you know what? You may want to step up your game to make sure you're the more productive member of the economy in a way that lifts all of us up to bring everyone up. That's illegal immigration is a different issue, but I think that the quiet, lurking angst about legal immigration of hardworking immigrants to this country. No, we should want that to hold ourselves and keep ourselves on our toes. You want to talk about a Protestant work ethic? Stop talking about it and start practicing it. And so, I think that this problem runs, I think it is more prevalent on the left than on the right, to be sure. I worry, though, that the way the culture war ends is actually by one side infecting the other and both sides preaching practicing at the same religion without recognizing that's actually what happened. And I'm keen to make sure it doesn't end that way. Part of why I'm writing this new book and talking about it.
Yeah. To me, that's populism. I'm always saying populism is liberalism. I think they're pretty much indistinguishable because I define populism as telling you what you want to hear instead of the truth. Right? I want to connect with you on an emotional level, gain your vote. And I do that by telling you what you want to hear. Others can define populism differently, I suppose. I'm not sure how. But that sounds to me a lot like liberalism. I always joke, like, progressives just tell you that you're always right, that you're never wrong, and that somebody else is responsible for your suffering. And that if you vote for them, they will make the other people pay for your suffering, right? They create that victimhood. Yeah. It doesn't seem that distinguishable from what I'm seeing on the right-wing populism. It's the politics of resentment, fundamentally.
Exactly. And I think resentment's an easy thing to cash in on. It's a lot harder to to galvanize people to be the best version of themselves in a way that rises above victimhood. And you know, we've lost this notion of forgiveness. Has everyone been wrong? Yeah, everyone's been wrong. Okay. Everyone's been wronged in every direction. Black people have been wrong, white people have been wrong, Asian people have been wrong, gay people have been wrong, straight people have been wrong. Get over it. And at a certain point, we're just going to have to move on and move forward. Are you married, Dan? Are you?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm married too. I mean, look, there are certain differences. If you're in a relationship, you're not gonna get to the bottom of it. You're just gonna have to decide to move on. And we're in a relationship with one another as co-equal citizens. And at some point, we're gonna have to agree to move on as well, as opposed to repeatedly playing the victim cards at one another. And that's what I'm worrying about happening in every direction in America. And so, I do think it's more prevalent on the left. And I'm not just trying to like be an equal critic of all sides for the sake of some sort of faux centrism. But I actually do think that I am actively worried about seeing the politics of grievance on the left and the short-term response that's rewarded on the right by having a politics of grievance that in some ways mirror images it. And I just think we have to graduate beyond it and be better.
And it happens because people get frustrated and they start screaming and they start saying, we got to fight fire with fire. Yeah. And I'm like, you don't put fires out with fire.
You got to fight fire with the fire hydrant.
Yeah. You use water.
With an extinguisher. Extinguisher. Exactly.
So let's just take a step back, guys. So Vivek, thanks for coming on. Thanks for what you're doing.
Great talking to you, man.
We're really excited to see how this develops.
Thank you. I appreciate it.